Good evening. My thanks to Mark and Maura for that very generous introduction and your incredible kindness. Lily and I have had a wonderful time here. Green College is everything that people think it is. And it's wonderful being over in the Lou Institute with the incredibly ebullient and happy staff who I hear in the corridor next to me. The book I'm writing there is called Sharing Knowledge, Shaping Europe. It's about the ways in which the United States used its technological leadership to promote non-proliferation in the early days of the Cold War. This talk is a little bit of a technical issue, so I thought for today I'd talk about another project I'm working on, funded by the National Science Foundation, called Controlling Knowledge in an Interconnected World. And this is a first take on this issue. I stress it's a work in progress. I need difficult questions because I need to be able to push to make it better. It's very much in its preliminary stages, but I hope that you find it interesting and that I can learn a lot from you. I'm sure I shall. I should mention that whenever I speak of China, I mean mainland China. And if there are any Chinese nationals here, I must apologize, for from time to time you'll find some very offensive remarks made about mainland China. This is an ethnographic study. It involves extensive interviewing with faculty and students at Georgia Tech, and some of the things they say you may not like. I must stress that we need to go beyond these feelings of anger and outrage, which I think will affect us as I go through the talk, and try to find ways of dealing with what is really an extremely tricky situation. I rely as a backdrop on a rather utopian view of what a university is or should be, and that's of course the concept of Green College itself, namely, and thank you for that, John, a place in which people feel free to speak their minds. Everything I'm going to talk about is about a world which is descending upon us little by little, in which that will not happen or will not be possible. I must have my water. So into the body of my talk. Shortly after the new academic year got underway in August 2013, about 150 faculty, staff, and a few students at Georgia Tech filled an auditorium to learn about what was called foreign collection threats to sensitive research. This word sensitive is important. Sensitive is not classified work. It is unclassified work which normally would be freely available and publishable. Classified work is obviously work on a nuclear warhead or a bioweapon. This program that I'm going to speak about throughout this talk is about work which is unclassified. The gathering was opened by the president of the Institute, and the meeting was dominated by a 30-minute movie entitled Game of Pawns, the Glenn Duffer Shriver story. And just to set the tone, I want to, if it works, show you a short clip from this movie. And it's gone to sleep. Oh gosh. And I urge you to watch closely and especially note who made the movie.
Life is like a game of chess, changing with each move. And to win the game, you must often sacrifice your pawns.
Note now who it's made by.
Since my first Spanish class in middle school, I never met a language I didn't like. Spanish, French, Mandarin, I love them all. Junior year in college, I got to live the dream. A year abroad in Shanghai, studying language and philosophy.
我很好，谢谢妈妈。
It was going to be the best year of my life. Shanghai was amazing. It fit me like a glove. I loved everything about it, the language, the culture, the nightlife, the people.
来2杯白酒。
She's sweet.
Yeah.
They're not My fair weather friend, I have the credit card.
Folks, credit card.
It's for emergencies, and I do believe this qualifies. Awesome! Besides, it's my going away party.
Whoa, what are you talking about?
Bad at home. After the break.
You're kidding me.
Dream's over, man. Time to face the real world.
This is the real world. I'm staying.
What's he gonna do?
Get a job?
No one's gonna hire you. You've gotta have the right visa.
Sorry, man.
Oh, the right visa!
So there it was. My dilemma. To stay in Shanghai, I needed a visa and a job. Then one morning I spotted an online ad. The Shanghai government was looking for American students to write papers on Chinese-American relations. That's how I met Amanda.
Hi, Glenn.
Yes.
Amanda.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for coming. So, how do you think the average American views China today?
I think China is an enigma to many in our country. There are some who view China with suspicion, even fear, over the way you control your currency, your people, and quite frankly, your fantastic economic growth.
Well, what do you think?
It's complicated, but I found the people here to be remarkably free. And there is a fantastic entrepreneurial class emerging.
You're a very thoughtful and candid young man. Qualities I admire. We want to make Shanghai the business center of the world. We want Americans to think of Shanghai first when they expand to China. To do that, we need to know how Westerners perceive us as a country and as a city.
So you want me to write about the business climate here?
First, something political. Use your judgment.
Okay, cool.
I wrote a paper about the tensions between China and the United States over North Korea's nuclear program. I was honest, but took a neutral tone.
Thank you, spell check. I still can't believe you're leaving, man. You know, you should be writing papers for these guys.
Why? What are they gonna do with them?
Who cares? It's just an essay. As long as they pay.
Green tea, okay?
And pay they did. I wrote a number of papers, and each time Amanda paid me in cash.
Thanks.
Then she invited me to meet her supervisor, Mr. Tong, in a fancy downtown hotel.
So, this is the bright young man I've heard so much about. Glad to meet you, Mr. Schreiber.
Please call me Glenn.
Okay, Glenn.
I'll stop it there. I think you have an idea.
What impressed me most about your paper?
As the Chinese connection becomes a little more ominous. Oh gosh. Sorry about that. The FBI loves this movie and plays it repeatedly, has played it all day, running over and over again at a conference I've attended. The point of the movie is that eventually Shriver accepts more and more money for this task. He gets caught by the American authorities for doing so, and he gets put in jail as a spy for 4 years. You can see him, if you watch the movie to the end, it's available on YouTube, you can see him in jail warning people about the dangers of being recruited by the Chinese authorities as an espionage and foreign intelligence agent. The FBI spent the entire session analyzing this movie in our presence. And they welcomed the opportunity, they said, as one of them put it, and that's where my title comes from, to bring the national security and academic worlds together. And they had one main point for all of us in the room. There were foreign nationals on campus, they said, especially from Asia and China, who would not hesitate to get hold of whatever sensitive, that's unclassified knowledge they could, by fair means or foul. Georgia Tech is ranked 36th nationally among all American universities. Its graduate program in engineering is ranked 6th on a list which is topped by MIT. It enrolled about 3,200 Asian students in fall 2013, out of a total of about 20,000. It is these students, and those from China in particular, that are of such concern to the FBI. Adopting a low profile and a conversational tone, they seek to alert the research community to the intelligence threats they might encounter. Here's a typical email that an applied physicist who is a friend of mine in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering would get, has just recently got. He's a man who does a lot of work in the field of nanotechnology. He works very closely with a group in Nanjing. Here it is. Dear Dr. X, my name is, and I work at the FBI field office in Atlanta. I spent a good deal of time working, collaborating with various faculty and student members at Georgia Tech, and our special agent in charge has formed a great partnership with your president. I wanted to reach out to you as an FBI representative and see if I could introduce myself, meet with you, and learn a little more about your areas of research in an effort to promote cooperation in support of Georgia Tech protecting its great research. Now, you may think it's normal for the Institute and the FBI, perhaps even, to protect cutting-edge research in engineering. But I must stress this goes much further than that. One of my graduate students, I'll call her Abigail, who works in the history of science and technology, organized a big conference in Washington on STS studies, science, technology, and society studies. 3 months before the conference, she was approached by the FBI in Atlanta, who asked her if they could spend an hour speaking to her about the dangers of this conference. Abigail was pretty upset, so I sat down with her for an hour with 2 young FBI agents who warned her that there were Chinese people coming to this meeting and they were concerned about them being engaged in what the FBI called suspicious behavior. They asked her to report any such suspicious behavior. She did. As it happens, she reported an Iranian student who disturbed her because he had asked her for the names of 2 people who had, and the emails, who presented a paper at the conference on Chinese solar panels. Now, you might find Abigail completely naive, but the fact is that the notion of what counts as suspicious behavior is so vague that she believed it was her duty to point out, as she said to me, China, Iran together, that sounded suspicious to me. It goes further. Another example, a Russian colleague of mine and an outspoken critique of the Putin regime, even a refugee from the Putin regime, recently arranged a 2-hour session on the situation in the Ukraine when that crisis was at its height. Rather similar to the session organized last week at the Liu Institute over the situation in Hong Kong. 2 days later, he found a card under his door from the FBI. Unbeknownst to him, an FBI agent had been present in the audience, had heard what was said at that meeting, and asked to speak with Alexei about his views on the Ukraine. Alexei, as was Abigail, was delighted to tell the FBI, although he himself is a refugee from a KGB state, that what a nasty man Putin was. So this is not a local ad hoc program. These are not just local anecdotes about a school, a major engineering school. This is part of a concerted, national, institutionalized counterintelligence initiative. The FBI has launched, and you can get this on the internet, something it calls the Academic Alliance Program, through which it offers a range of services, as it puts it, from assistance to protecting intellectual property to help resisting recruitment by foreign intelligence agents and terrorist organizations, as well as to dealing with what it calls animal rights and eco-terrorism. In return, it seeks access to those who would benefit from its message. It also wants to pass on it also wants us to pass on information to the FBI regarding suspicious incidents on campus. The Academic Alliance includes something called the National Security Higher Education Board. This board brings together the apparatus of the national security state, the FBI, the CIA, the DoD, with about 24 university presidents. In 2010, its membership included, of course, Georgia Tech, but also representatives from UCLA, NYU, SUNY, Carnegie Mellon, Cornell, Duke, and Northwestern. A large spectrum of leading American research institutions. Its aim is to foster understanding between two disparate realms, the freewheeling world of knowledge production and the closed world of security. It seeks, in its own terms, to mitigate risk, by emphasizing the current dangers from individuals and nations that want to exploit America's tradition of academic openness to illicitly acquire information that will advance the military agendas and economic competitiveness to the detriment of American global leadership. And once again, in its rather super poster, actually, you see the chess game. How does the FBI propose to mitigate risk? Firstly, as the agents told us in the town hall meeting, awareness and reporting of suspicious behavior are the two most important things you can do. So we're expected to report on suspicious behavior. What counts as suspicious behavior? The FBI emphasizes precisely those things that you would not normally regard to be suspicious. That's their point, right? The things that you take as normal and perhaps positive on a campus, in their view, is a trap. So typical examples include a foreign national who casually asks you questions about research that is not directly related to the research that they're actually doing on campus. So if you have a physicist who speaks to you about your chemical research, that's a bit suspicious because really physicists should only show an interest in physics. Another one is they spend too much time in the library. Who wouldn't dream of having people spending photocopying material from fields that are not directly connected with their own? All of this is a problem. Excessive curiosity, in other words, is supposed to set off the alarm bells. Leading researchers are also warned about devious strategies to acquire information from them. Here's just one example, which is posted on the FBI website, among many, which I'll quickly give you. Again, it's a bit, why am I getting this thing wrong each time? An Asian student invites personnel from his Asian university lab to visit his American university. Without permission, the visitors take photographs of all the equipment in the lab, including the make and model of the equipment, in order to reproduce the American university's lab at the Asian university. About a year into the collaboration, the graduate advisor becomes concerned that too much information is going out to the Asian research lab and not enough is coming back to the American university. So he cancels the collaboration. So now how are we, as members of the public interested in higher education and of the academic community, to respond to all of this? How do we at Green College feel about this, being as we are in a place where people feel free to speak their minds? Outrage, perhaps, at least for those of us who still believe that academic freedom means the freedom to exchange ideas openly with anyone, regardless of race, color, class, creed, or nationality. Outrage, perhaps, the eyes and ears of the national security state that we now know is engaged in a vast system of surveillance of all our communication systems, that those eyes and ears are also now reaching into the core of an institution that, at least in a democratic society, is defined by its commitment to openness, creativity, and freedom from state control. Yeah, but that's a bit simple. It's sobering to realize that the very openness and the free flow of information that we prize makes universities extremely vulnerable to this form of external intelligence gathering. For example, the New York Times reported in July last year that the University of Wisconsin alone, just that university, was subjected to 90,000 cyber attacks in one day, and most of them were from China. 90,000 to 100,000 in one day. In a similar vein, reliable sources, the people I speak to at Georgia Tech, and I'm careful to choose people I can trust, tell me that as many as 3 or 4 foreign students or visitors to Georgia Tech each year engage in what they call illicit information gathering. So shouldn't we also be bothered by that? Shouldn't we also be outraged by the exploitation of our commitment to the free exchange of ideas by individuals who are sometimes actually covert agents of foreign governments? We cannot simply, in the name of academic freedom, dismiss the presence of FBI on the campus, even if we wish to, not simply as an abuse of state power. We have to recognize that it is part of a more general response to an external attack on the American Research University. So what are we going to do about it? If we move beyond the sense of deep outrage, I can't resolve that dilemma in half an hour. I would like a conversation about what we should do about it, though. But I can at least provide some elements that I think can help us to chart our way forward. My central claim is that in some sense, we've got what we've deserved. That the current situation is precipitated by the convergence of two major structural changes in academia. One is the commercialization of academic research. The other is the globalization of the knowledge economy. Let me take each in turn. Firstly, as we all know, today universities are anything but ivory towers cut off from social need. There has been a sea change in the practice of research that got underway roughly in the 1980s in the United States with the passage of the Bayh-Dole and other acts, and which pushed research and development in universities and, by the way, in national laboratories, closer to the development end of the spectrum in a very crude, linear model where on the left you have basic fundamental research, which is really blue sky, follow your nose where it leads research, and as you move along in further stages of your research, you get closer and closer to producing socially useful knowledge and then developing socially useful products of various kinds for whatever purpose. This push to encourage researchers to think about how they could develop socially useful knowledge was triggered by the determination to meet the economic challenge from Japan, but it has now become generalized in the name of protecting America's economic security. Prior to the 1980s, research that was paid for with public money was roughly speaking regarded as public property. Now, individual researchers and their institutions are authorized to exploit their results for private gain. Faculty and researchers in national labs, as well as at universities, were encouraged to patent their research findings, and offices of technology transfer sprung up all over academia to facilitate the process. Getting a patent became just as important as publishing an article. The current chair, for example, of electrical and computer engineering at Georgia Tech has 230 articles, 30 patents with more pending, and has his own startup company called Whisper in his field of communications and information theory. He's absolutely typical of any one of the senior engineers in my institution and probably any major American university today. In brief, university research has become increasingly focused on developing useful knowledge for commercial and military markets. It's become market-driven. This is often summarized under the rubric of the commercialization of academia. And it doesn't only happen in the United States, it is also well entrenched here at UBC. And you probably have seen this, but in the event you haven't, that's from the UBC website. UBC is a recognized leader for its technology transfer and commercialization activities. 150 spin-off companies have been formed around UBC technologies, and UBC research discoveries have been at the heart of technologies, therapies, and products that have generated well over $5 billion in sales. So that's the first feature of this world, the commercialization of research, often at the expense, this is quite tricky to manipulate, at the expense of the pursuit of wisdom. Secondly, and intersecting with this, is a global knowledge economy that has emerged over the last 2 decades. This is both an opportunity and a threat. It's an opportunity because, in the United States at least, they depend on foreign nationals to sustain the dynamic of its extremely efficient and leading research system. But it is also a threat because the United States fears that these foreign nationals will exploit the knowledge produced in university laboratories to the detriment of American scientific and technological leadership. In other words, as the knowledge produced in the global research environment in which foreign nationals are omnipresent is more self-consciously guided by application and the pursuit of profit, so it becomes more vulnerable to rivals that seek to learn and cream off what they need for personal gain and to increase the economic and military strength of their home countries. Let me ratchet this up a notch. We can say very broadly that the neoliberal pressure to roll back state support for universities, for example, the state contributes only 18% now to Georgia Tech's annual operating budget, although it's still a state university, so-called, that the pressure to roll back state support for universities and promote the commercialization of research has pushed universities to do research that is far more consciously directed to getting out socially useful applications that can be patented. It's no longer good enough to follow your nose where it leads you. This emphasis on producing useful knowledge makes the university particularly attractive for foreign governments who seek to quickly enhance their military and economic strength. As a result, in an ironic twist of fate, the neoliberal push to commercialize the results of research has called forth its antithesis, the national security state, which wants to regulate the circulation of knowledge, right? And a system of surveillance that seeks to control and monitor foreign nationals, even when they're doing unclassified research that is deemed sensitive. Emphasizing and undoubtedly exaggerating, John, you'll agree with that, one aspect of this is the economic historian Phil Mirowski. Mirowski writes this: universities have ceased to serve as repositories for wisdom and have become profit centers for the generation of proprietary knowledge. Now little more than temples of mammon, they have gradually refashioned themselves to satisfy a neoliberal blueprint for a vibrant marketplace of ideas responsive to corporate concerns and the needs of the national security state. Mirowski emphasizes one arm of this double movement. The FBI emphasizes the other. The open environment of a university is an ideal place for foreign intelligence services to find recruits, propose and nurture ideas, learn and even steal research data. As universities become more like businesses, they must both foster entrepreneurial innovation and control the circulation of knowledge at the point of production. They do this through a combination of export controls and surveillance, and they hope to plug every possible loophole through which knowledge can leak abroad. I have heard a senior official in the American Department of Commerce say, if universities behave like businesses, we will treat them like businesses. We will hold them accountable to the same business standards and the same national standards as we would hold any business. In other words, we will survey them, we will punish them and sanction them for violating any kind of export control. The immediate precedent for the current attempts to police the circulation of knowledge to foreign nationals on campus is to be found in the late Cold War. In the post-detente 1980s, the Reagan administration singled out universities, in particular, as a major threat to national security. The director of the CIA made a plea for what he called to combine both effective export control policies and vigorous counterintelligence programs to impede the acquisition of science and technology and, in general, useful knowledge from American campuses by people from the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. This Cold War agenda has been revivified and focused again on academia for a number of reasons. Most fundamentally, I think, there's been the commercialization of research and the production of knowledge that was originally stimulated by the Japanese threat. This, of course, was followed by the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and the anthrax attacks a week later that have heightened fears that bioweapons-related research needs to be very closely controlled. And then, of course, came China's determination to leap ahead and surpass the United States in science and technology. And that's the one that I want to talk about for a moment, also because that's the one that the FBI insists upon again and again. In January 2006, Beijing initiated a 15-year medium to long-term plan for the development of science and technology. It calls for the country to become an innovation-oriented society by 2020 and the world leader surpassing the United States in science and technology by 2050. And it commits China to developing capabilities for what it calls indigenous innovation, so as to leapfrog into leading positions in new science-based industries by as early as 2020. To this end, the plan proposes that China invests an increasing amount of its GDP in research and development over the next few years. The Chinese authorities also realize that imported knowledge from abroad by foreign students trained here or in the United States will fall on barren soil if there's not a strong indigenous capability of scientists and engineers who can exploit this knowledge productively. So it will continue to increase its university population at home. This slide is a little tricky, that grew. The slide that is in blue has you look at the right axis for the numbers. That's undergraduate students enrolled in China. As you can see, that has grown from something like 3 million to 16 million in those years. The slide in purple with the axis on the left is the graduate student population in China over those years. And you can see a massively increased trend upwards over that period. This data, which is always hard to get, is from Physics Today. It has also increased the number of trained scientists and engineers, trained in China, that is, as you can see now, coming roughly to about 1 million. With this in-house strength, we can have debates about the quality of this education, but at least in terms of the numbers, China sees itself as better able to capitalize on PhDs who are trained abroad, typically in the US. And that's National Science Foundation data on the number of scientists, from Chinese scientists engaged in science and engineering who get PhDs in the United States. It hovers around 3,500 per year. Of course, in the past, and this is why America is not worried about this, many of these people have stayed on in the United States and, of course, contributed, therefore, to the strength of the research system. The Chinese authorities are aware of this, and in 2008 launched something called the 1,000 Talents Program, aimed to recruit the most outstanding members of this elite back to their homeland, with huge financial incentives. By summer 2011, about 2,100 of these people had chosen to go back to China to lend their skills to the nation. Many of these people are bona fide students. All the same, many of my engineering colleagues at Tech are certain that there are spies among them. As one senior applied physicist put it, if you were a Chinese spy, or you were trying to figure out how to get US technology, well, how would you go about it? The technology-centric institutions in the US are very, very open organizations from which there is leading-edge technology that is much, much easier to access than through a firm like IBM. Georgia Tech is somewhere in the group of 10 leading technology-focused institutions. So if you're in Pakistan or China, wondering where to send people to, well, Tech is top of that list. Another one put it this way: they're overtly doing everything they can to steal everything they can. Statistically, he said, the numbers are small. 1/10 of 1% of all people do something stupid and bad. But then we have about 4,000 students here on campus, and 1/10 of 1% is 4 students. And that's about what we see every year. And that is cyber attacks, students on campus performing in clearly active ways to do things they shouldn't be doing, and that caught the attention of various organizations outside of Tech. And most, he added, were Chinese. One of those various organizations outside of Tech was obviously the FBI. The FBI seeks to train us all in counterintelligence. Our Office of Research Integrity, you must have the same here, trains us in export controls legislation. Together they work to stop sensitive knowledge leaking abroad. So far I've only spoken about the FBI and the surveillance program. Now let me turn to the most arcane of all topics, export control. I've spent 5 days in export control training. On campus, we have programs that train students from the day they arrive, actually, as graduate students in export control. And I've also been to a professional training group. It doesn't mean to say that I'm familiar with this. It is mind-blowingly obscure and controversial. So how can a university that produces knowledge have anything to do with export control? Well, the first thing you have to do is change your view of what export means. To export doesn't mean simply to put a car or a tank or a widget in a box, to put a customs slip on it and to mail it abroad. To export can also mean, and this is crucial, to share knowledge with a foreign national. And it can even count as an export if you're doing it at home, on your campus, in your lab. So here you are as an American professor teaching a student from Russia something that is regarded as sensitive knowledge. That can count as an export. This would count as an export, this talk, if I was giving a talk about sensitive knowledge to people who were not American citizens or foreign nationals, because I am conveying orally and through my PowerPoint sensitive information to people who are not actually, as I say, American citizens or foreign nationals. For that, I would need an export license. And that export license I'd have to get, depending on what I'm talking about, from the Department of Commerce or the Department of State. Here's a lab situation. It's fabricated, rather. Here's a lab situation. Imagine that prof on the right with glasses is showing anthrax spores to, say, a German and a Russian student. He would need a license to do that. Because that would count as a deemed export because he is sharing knowledge that is sensitive, in this case, about a potential bioweapon. It's a deemed export in the sense that the export doesn't actually happen at that moment, but it is deemed to happen because you assume the student will go home taking that information with him or her, and so in that sense, the act of exportation has already occurred. Only the United States, I've been told, has this particular concept of a deemed export. And the Department of Commerce is extremely anxious to tighten up the implementation of the deemed export regulation. Now, I stress, you need a license if the knowledge is sensitive. Who decides if the knowledge is sensitive? There is one general criteria. If the research results are publishable in the open literature, they are normally not sensitive, nor therefore subject to export controls. The problem is that this criterion of normally publishable is easily overwritten by a sponsor who might have some commercial or military application in mind way down the road, and as your project evolves and moves closer and closer to the market. So a graduate student might find himself or herself on something which is openly publishable, and suddenly, as they make a step forward in the research and it looks as though there's an application in mind, that will become sensitive, and any foreign student in that project can only work on it with an export license. This excessively bureaucratic and rather arbitrary process is playing havoc with life in the research space. Faculty and students worry about whether or not they're transgressing the limits of the export-free zone, and so exposing themselves to ferocious penalties for sharing sensitive knowledge with foreign nationals. And indeed, every time you meet someone, you need to ask if they're a foreign national before you can begin to talk about this work, which is obviously absurd. So what you do, the default position is to say as little as possible. Let me illustrate this with a few examples. Any project that produces, I'll just get rid of that slide, that produces sensitive knowledge triggers what is called a technology control plan. This plan establishes who's working on the project, if there are any foreign nationals on the project, if the persons then who are American students will be separated from those foreign nationals, will they be in a locked room, will the door of the room be locked, will anybody else have access to that room, will anyone have access to the computers that they're using, to their data, to their jump drives, to their emails. And every PI or university professor has to make absolutely sure that that is respected. American students working on basic science, this is basic science, that may eventually have some military use, have to be really hived off from foreign nationals in the same group. So here's one PI speaking to me. The computers that we're using are dedicated to this project. They're physically located in a room that's been inspected by somebody from the security infrastructure at Georgia Tech. The door is locked. The student closes the door when he works on the project. There are issues about the computer equipment that we use for this, so he may not carry around memory sticks, hard disks with data, and he certainly may not take his data with him out of the country. Physical segregation is complemented by self-censorship. This is what you say to your graduate student. This is what you can talk about. You don't need to show anybody that piece of hardware. The data that you get off your computer, you show that to nobody, okay? Applications are particularly sensitive. You explain to him that when talking about his work on, this person is working on photonic crystals, the student can discuss in very basic terms, use the same words as you would find in the open literature on photonic crystals. But I've told him that he may not talk about applications, not talk specifically about what he wants to do with photonic crystals, who's sponsoring his work on photonic crystals, and what the sponsor will use it for. By the way, the applications of this work will be done at JPL, at Johns Hopkins, the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, not even at Georgia Tech. the student is working entirely on basic work, which is then fed over to the applied physics laboratory where it is controlled. But even so, all of these constraints apply on his work. Maintaining the gap between what he does and what he can talk about is a management issue. Students are educated about it from the day they arrive and trained to respect it when they discuss their work with others. The same person. I actually have a visiting student from China who's also working on photonic crystals. Related insofar as the basic science goes, but there's almost a firewall between her and my American student. I mean, I really can't send her to talk to my own graduate student beyond just the most basic things, which are in the public domain already. Staying with export control in the export control-free zone requires constant vigilance. Vigilance in the classroom. Here's a professor talking about a lecture he gave on the science and design of gas turbine engines. And there are times, he said, when something might pop into your head from your research. So you look around the room and you say, wait a minute, there are foreign nationals in the room. Well, we better just move on, he said. You might want to bring it up, but you don't have an export license for that, so you just self-censor. Vigilance also when you deal with your peers, especially if they're Chinese. So you're asked to evaluate a paper from China submitted for publication. You must restrict your remarks to pointing out errors, but you must also avoid telling the person how they might improve their work. So you'll say, this is a well-explained phenomenon, or equation 7 doesn't converge, but you will avoid sharing insights you may have from your own research about how this paper could be made better. You don't need to go there if you don't have to. The spirit of free inquiry, the pleasure of pursuing the argument wherever it leads, the satisfaction that comes from discussing ideas with students, colleagues, peers, this is no longer possible except in a restricted circle from which foreign nationals are excluded. Face-to-face interactions cannot be spontaneous. The knowledge that is shared must be calibrated. Things must be left unsaid. Collaboration is reduced to the minimum level compatible with sustaining some level of trust. You must minimize the footprint of your own research in your conversations with others. Green College, I remind you, is a place where people feel free to speak their minds. If the practices I've just described were implied here, the entire community would simply collapse. So where's the opposition? I stress that everybody I've interviewed is a liberal American in the liberal sense of the word. I'm very careful, otherwise I can understand you might have a really rabid patriot who might automatically say these things. These are all liberal, quite disturbed people by what's going on. So this is what the senior researcher said to me: we're beaten into submission by 3 levels of fear. Basically, it is fear that controls their capacity to break these rules. There are 3 levels of fear. Firstly, personal ruin. One extraordinary feature of the export regime is that penalties for infraction are personal, not an institutional responsibility. Georgia Tech establishes a highly sophisticated system of export control and expects every faculty and student to learn how to do it properly. And after they have done due diligence, in their view, it's no longer their problem. So indeed, if you as an individual violate export control regulations and the university can show that it has done due diligence, you will go to jail for up to 10 years or have a fine of $250,000. And there is somebody in jail at the moment from the University of Tennessee who shared knowledge that he thought was basic with an Iranian and a Chinese student. The courts and the FBI believed that it was not basic, that it was sensitive, that he should have had an export control license to do it, and he's now serving a 4-year jail term. The second reason is an institutional fear. The institution itself, which relies heavily on external funding, Georgia Tech, $650 million a year of external funding, is afraid that if it's seen to be soft on regulating and imposing export control regimes, it will lose its funding, because the federal government will simply, and the Department of Defense, or ARPA, or the Office of Naval Research, or corporations, will no longer fund research if they believe the institute is lax about knowledge flows. So as one person said, a senior export control officer told me, it's not the fine that bothers us, it's our institutional integrity, our capacity to attract grants. we would lose so much more than fines in our credibility as a research institution, in our ability to do research and get funding for our research from people and from agencies of the government or from corporations that regard us lax on export control enforcement. Our faculty would say, hey, look, if I can't get my research funding, I'm out of here. So they fear losing the best faculty and not getting contracts again. Every firm, and there are many small firms in the export control business, are terrified of breaching the regulations because they will no longer get a federal contract. And if it's a small firm, shall we say, making specialized lenses for infrared glasses, which are very sensitive because of the night vision possibilities, they're ruined. So the government has an enormous power to destroy individuals and firms with the system. Finally, at Georgia Tech, there's the fear that the leak of a controlled item might jeopardize the security of the United States without even realizing it. It's a scary world out there. People ask, do you realize what could happen if someone got that piece of information? We don't want them to get that piece of information. We don't even want them to know what that piece of information is. So we cover it. You know, we have people who are trying to do really, really bad things to us. The escalation of the danger of a local leakage of knowledge to a global risk is typical of the mindset of the people that I've interviewed. Indeed, what I like about this quote is this escalation of a minor leakage to a potential catastrophe. We have a sensitive pixel of knowledge. Someone tells us that actually it's an extremely sensitive pixel of knowledge. You don't even want people to know that you have it. And that's because, the last step in this mental process of short-circuiting, it can be used to do really bad things for you. In this way, the loss of information to a student on campus subtly morphs into the acquisition of a weapon of mass destruction by a terrorist. Well, once you've taken that path, no wonder you agree that tight controls on knowledge circulation are imperative. Okay, now I conclude, which will take me 5 minutes. It is something of an irony that even as neoliberal pressure for the deregulation of research encourages individual intellectual entrepreneurship, the patenting of knowledge in the pursuit of profit, and the rollback of the state, so at the same time the logic of national security imposes an extensive regulatory regime supplemented by surveillance that penetrates to the core of the face-to-face research encounter. These two moments in the policing of research did not emerge simultaneously, even though they coexist today. Indeed, the commercialization of research has ironically prepared the ground historically for the regulation of research at the site of knowledge production. The commercialization of research demanded a self-imposed code of discipline to secure your private gain. If you have a patent in the pipeline, you don't talk to other people about what you're planning to do. The second mode imposed an external code of discipline in the name of economic and national security. Practices that were already familiar and acceptable to protect intellectual property were already available resources needed to comply with government-imposed restrictions on the flow of knowledge. Together, they've produced a disciplined, self-censoring group of researchers that are trained to define the spatial and epistemic boundaries of knowledge sharing and who are always on the alert for suspicious behavior. And there's a gesture there to Foucault for those of you who read Foucault. Knowledge does not circulate freely on many American campuses. There is a boundary between what can be said and what must be left unspoken that is constantly negotiated in quotidian practice, no matter what kind of work you do. The much publicized pursuit of open access and the oft-recorded explosion of international scientific exchange occur within a limiting framework of which most of us are not even aware, and that is generally completely ignored in the literature of science studies that looks at the transformation of research in universities. So what are we to do? Knowledge circulates around the world along many, many paths. Some years ago, the CIA tried to evaluate how China actually enhanced its knowledge basis. And it reported that China's technical advances have been made on the basis of classified and unclassified information derived from espionage, contact with American and other countries' researchers, conferences and publications, unauthorized media disclosures, declassified American weapons information, and China's own indigenous development. So obviously what is happening at Georgia Tech is one part of a huge picture of knowledge accumulation. And the CIA concluded the relative contribution of each of these points of access cannot be determined. This is true of every advanced society today. Every country learns about what others are doing through multiple communication channels, including espionage. It is pointless to plug every leak. The only reasonable security policy is to protect the most sensitive knowledge. In the jargon of the day, to build high walls around small fields. To classify if necessary, or at least to protect as much as possible, that kind of information which really is important for your economic or your national security. So we need to build high walls around small fields rather than having generalized Hoover-like systems to mop up every possible bit of knowledge that is produced and to protect it if we can. There's nothing original at all in what I'm saying. This point has been made over and over again over the last probably 15 years, because I first got into this through studying NASA in the late 90s, when this first became really quite important from my point of view. It's been made over and over again the last 15 years by senior members of the research establishment. It has made no difference whatsoever. And perhaps the ultimate power of the national security state is there, in its capacity to create the impression that opposition is pointless, not to say dangerous, or more perniciously in its capacity to create a climate of fear that is so deep-rooted, a fear that is so deep-rooted that it demands compliance at any cost and it renders opposition unimaginable. Thank you.